Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome back to the Learning to Die podcast. Today we are joined by, now Seamus, is it Professor, Dr. Lord, Knight? What would you like to be called?
Call me Seamus. My official title is Professor, but Seamus is probably just the easiest way to proceed.
That's great because that's great because Kieran said he wanted to be called Lord Kieran in 2022. We have the great privilege of being joined today by Professor Seamus O'Mahony, and as Seamus just said, he's not hung up on titles there, but Seamus has written this great book that Kieran came across a few months ago called Can Medicine Be Cured? In addition, Seamus has also written another book on the subject of death and dying, which I've heard you on a few other podcasts while Seamus discussing. So today's conversation will be a combination probably of that book, Can Medicine Be Cured, and your previous book on death and dying. And then you've obviously published another book since then as well. So you've been quite busy in your transition into retirement, which is not really a retirement. So it might be nice, Seamus, to give us a kind of a quick overview of your background and your recent publications, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, thanks, Ian, and thanks, Kieran, for inviting me to your podcast. So I'm from Cork. I grew up in Cork, and I live in Cork. I qualified from the medical school in UCC a long time ago, 1983. I worked in the British National Health Service for 14 years, from the kind of late 80s to the early 90s, working in Scotland and Yorkshire. I came back to Cork 20 years ago and worked for many years at Cork University Hospital. I retired just before COVID arrived. Whether that was good timing or bad timing, I'm not entirely sure. I've written 3 books, as you've mentioned. I don't regard myself as retired, really. I'm doing other things. I work part-time in a COVID vaccination centre in West Cork. I'm writing my 4th book. I'm a visiting professor at the Centre for the Humanities and Health at King's College London. But with the pandemic, I haven't been able to do much visiting, but I am connected there. I'm also a member of a commission organised or run by the Lancet, the famous medical journal. They organise these commissions on big topics, and I've been working with a global group put together by the Lancet over the last several years on the value of death, which many people might find paradoxical. The final report of that is due to be published in the end of January, so within the next 3 weeks. So I've been working with that group now for the last 4 years. So I've done a lot of things over the years, but I now regard myself primarily as a writer and teacher and part-time vaccinator. So that's me.
Excellent. Seamus, do you mind me asking how did you find a transition from going from like the sciences into, writing for, we'll say the general population, where, you can't kind of get into the scientific terms too heavy, or you're trying to explain it in a more broad sense, and you can't use lots of statistics or p-values or, you know, graphs and talk about these kind of R squared numbers and all that. How did you manage to kind of cross over that? Because you've done it really well, and it's really, the way you write is I'm just kind of hooked for the next sentence, the next paragraph. How did you do that? How did you make that transition?
Well, I started writing about 10 years ago for a publication called the Dublin Review of Books, which is an online literary magazine. And I started writing about science and medicine and health. And obviously my audience there was and is a general audience. And so I learned through writing for that publication how to translate technical scientific ideas for a general readership without causing them too much pain. And I was pleasantly surprised that people were reading it. And were interested in it, not just doctors and scientists and people working in healthcare, but general readers. So that was kind of an apprenticeship. And I also found that over the many decades of writing for medical journals, that your readership was far more appreciative if you could render what you were trying to say readable and enjoyable, and even occasionally witty, which is quite difficult to work into a medical journal. But I did try to do that over a long time. So I had been writing for many years before, you know, these books came out. And so I did have a long apprenticeship. And I always thought that just because you're writing about something that is scientific or technical, it doesn't mean that it should be difficult or painful for the reader. Any person with should be able to access these ideas. And I worked very hard over the years to make what I was writing about accessible to the intelligent general reader. That's what I've always aimed to do.
Yeah. Well, it's an excellent book, and the way it comes across. So I really enjoyed it. Yeah, and can't wait to finish it. I'm actually going to jump on and order the other one about death and dying as well, because I think that's going to be fascinating as well. Because that's obviously the title of our podcast, Learning to Die, and it's a fascination that Kieran and I have, because we think that if we can sort of come to terms with the process of that we will die someday, that we will live a more fruitful life. So we're trying to get every bit of juice out of this bone as we can.
Okay.
I might just throw it over to Kieran now, because I know Kieran's got about probably 20 million questions for you, Seamus. He's more than excited than I am about this book.
Yeah, and just on that, I'd like to just add to that the way that it's written is really, really engaging. Like the actual prose and the style of writing and the mixture of even when you were writing about topics that would be typically considered in standard discussions to be like uncomfortable topics. Like it could be death, for example, or criticizing certain approaches policy-wise, or certain politicians or certain policymakers or certain policies themselves that have led to bad outcomes. You still manage to do so in a way that there's like there's regular chuckles throughout the book, like, you know, over and over again. So, and that kind of the kind of, how would you put, what's that old phrase about a spoonful of sugar with the medicine or whatever, you know, that's what it kind of reminded me of. And so I really like to applaud that, because it was a really, really, really enjoyable book. Like, even apart from the actual ideas, just as someone who I just enjoy reading, it was actually a really, really engaging book to read. So I'd like to add to that point by Ian.
Thank you very much. That's kind of what I was aiming to do. So it's great to get that feedback. So thank you.
No, it's class. And just as a kind of an opening point, I think, or not kind of an opening kind of provision of context, for the listeners. And this is a kind of a question that occurred to me based on my own reading, but also based on talking to people, even in the last week or so, about the changes based on stuff I learned from this book, and then went on to look up some other resources based on the changes that medicine went through over a relatively short period of time, over particularly the last century or so. Would it be possible to kind of give a mile high overview, just to provide some context of where we're at now in 2021 and the priorities that, let's say, big medicine with a capital B, capital M has, versus where it kind of came from, even in the beginning of the 1900s, and then maybe going through where medicine was in and around the beginning of the 1900s, First World War kind of an era, then through the post kind of Second World War kind of golden era, into now the kind of big science, big data, big pharma, big tech kind of just to give that kind of a landscape, and especially, I suppose, in relation to England and Ireland, as where your background is, and as exemplars of Western medicine at large, I suppose.
Okay. In the book I mentioned, I started this story by talking to my mother, who's 89, and she was talking and telling me about how her brother Billy died in his teens in 1946 of spinal tuberculosis. And this was, and still is for her, a terrible trauma. He was only 17 years old. And he died at home because medicine had nothing to offer in terms of curative treatment. And just 2 years after his death, Billy's death, the very first ever randomized controlled trial in medicine was published by the British Medical Journal in 1948 on streptomycin, the first effective antimicrobial or antibiotic drug for tuberculosis. So you may have heard of this term, randomized controlled trial. It's now the sort of gold standard means of assessing new drugs and treatments, where the volunteers for these trials are randomly assigned to getting the drug, the active drug, half of them, and half of them are randomly assigned to a dummy or a placebo. And this eliminates, to a great extent, bias. And this is a statistical method which has been proven over many decades to be the correct and most effective way of assessing new interventions and treatments in medicine. So I have argued that there was a golden era in medicine. I have said roughly from about the mid-30s to the mid-1980s, where we had this dramatic innovation. So in that 50 years, you had the introduction of effective treatment for tuberculosis. Tuberculosis killed, on average, 10,000 people in Ireland every year, more in some years. We had sanatoria built all over the country to care for people with tuberculosis. So this was, a devastating illness, which had a major social stigma as well, by the way, because it was linked with poverty. So suddenly this disease, which had devastated this country for centuries, for decades, was curable. Antibiotics then arrived, penicillin arrived. And there was a host of other things. You had organ transplantation, you had CT scanning, you had MRI scanning, you had cardiac bypass surgery, you had kidney dialysis, and so on and so on. So modern medicine, as we now understand it, arrived in a very short period, in about a period of roughly about 50 years. And, talking to someone like my mother, who remembers what life was like before all of these innovations arrived is fascinating. So she talks very often to me about Billy dying. And it's kind of heartbreaking to listen to, because nowadays the overwhelming likelihood is that, he would be cured and would have survived. And it's very heartbreaking to hear about the death of a 17-year-old boy and how it devastated the family. And my mother herself got pneumonia some years before that and was given one of the first, it wasn't an antibiotic, it was an antimicrobial called sulfapyridine. It was made by a company called May and Baker. So the tablets were known as MNB, and she survived because she got this early antimicrobial treatment. She got a severe pneumonia, but Billy wasn't quite so lucky. And he only missed out by about 2 years. Streptomycin, as I say, first ever randomized controlled trial, 2 years later. And then after the Second World War, there was this dramatic investment in the USA and in Britain in medical research. So there was this famous report, the Bush report, by this guy Vannevar Bush, who was actually a physicist. He was head of Roosevelt's R&D department during the Second World War, and he wrote this famous report which urged massive financial investment in basic research, particularly medical and biological research. And this led to this dramatic expansion in biomedical research in the post-war years. So this was the sort of foundation for what became big science, big medicine. But by about the mid-1980s, and certainly by the time I qualified, I hit the very end of that golden age. I just hit the end of it. So I started working as a doctor in the 1983, and that was kind of towards the end of this golden age. And I've written in the book about going to a big conference, the first big conference I went to in 1987 in London. And I had a poster presentation at this conference, very pleased with myself. And it was the Golden Jubilee of the British Society of Gastroenterology. So my speciality that I worked in over many years was gastroenterology. And this meeting that I went to celebrated the Golden Jubilee of this society. So it was founded in 1937. And every delegate who went to this meeting was given this book, which was a collection of publications of the most significant and important papers in gastroenterology over that 50 years. And I wrote about how this was a kind of a model for this golden age, how this book summarized what had happened in this miraculous 50 years and all the things that came in. So in gastroenterology, endoscopy, which is now kind of what gastroenterologists do, was invented. Liver transplantation came in. The cause of peptic ulcers, which affected 10% of the adult male population, was discovered, and so on and so on and so on. But after this golden age, which was the age that I worked in, which was more of a sort of a bronze age or an iron age, developments and advances were much smaller, they were slower, much more attritional. So I guess you could say that the low-hanging fruit somehow had been picked during this golden age. And despite the huge increase in medical research and in the medical industrial complex in general, actual huge advances were relatively few and far between in my professional lifetime compared to the 50 years of the golden age. So that's the kind of summary of that period.
If I could add on, and in relation to that, it's something that's And I know Ian wants to talk about this as well, because it's something that, like, I come from a sports science background. I did sport and exercise science in UL and spent a lot of time over the last, I suppose when I started in UL in 2008, so the last 12, 13 years in this reading sports science papers, etc. And a big problem, I suppose, in sports science literature and sports science research, it's mirrored, or it's mirroring most likely what you kind of wrote about in the book, which was, I suppose, if I was to kind of draw it down to some of the worst research that's the most useless that's produced, is produced by people who don't themselves have skin in the game as practitioners. So there's a disconnect between people that are leading research groups and people that are directing choice of topic for research and what's actually happening, quote unquote, in the trenches as coaches or as high performance directors or whatever with sports teams or research or sporting institutes or teams in particular, just being on the ground, on the pitch with players, or etc., or on the track. And some of the best research that's been done are being done by a mixture of particularly researchers that are working in universities that also happen to be coaches or had very recently been coaches, but now are working in academia as something that's an add-on to their career, but they spent a long time in the trenches, let's say. Whereas the difference is, or research groups that may very well be led by someone who's a full-time academic and isn't a practitioner, but employs or gets on board people who are very much have their finger on the pulse regularly with athletes. And that parallel seemed to me so striking as a difference, because you had this point in this kind of analogy of this notion in science of doing research, producing papers, adding brick by brick to the wall of science, or to the wall of medicine, let's say. But that so many of these bricks ended up just getting chucked into a field and not ending up being used to build anything, because they're just research for its own sake. So something that struck me during the golden era in your writing was that so much of the golden era stuff was, like, I think you mentioned, for example, the gluten and celiac example of this guy who happened to notice it as a practitioner, and that went on to be this breakthrough as an example. So would you be able to speak to that a bit? And am I right on the parallel?
No, I'm struck by your use of the phrase "skin in the game," which is I like that goes to the heart of it and what has changed. So you mentioned the example of celiac disease, which we now know is due to gluten sensitivity. And it's hard to countenance this now, but before the link between gluten and celiac disease was discovered, children very often died of this condition. It was very often fatal. And the doctor who discovered the link was a clinical pediatrician in Holland called Wim Dicke. And this was key to the golden age. Many of these great discoveries were made by doctors who had skin in the game, were working as full-time clinicians. They weren't working in universities or research centers. They weren't bringing in huge grants. They didn't have teams of postdocs and PhDs working for them. They were clinical doctors who were dealing with very often fatal diseases for which there was not a treatment, let alone a cure. And he was typical of this golden age. So he noticed during the Nazi occupation of Holland, particularly the winter, I think, of 1940-41, which was known as the hunger winter, the winter of hunger, when the Dutch population were famously reduced to consuming tulip bulbs. There was so little food around. One of the foodstuffs that was in very short supply was wheat. And Dicke noticed that his celiac children, who were being fed some alternative to wheat, which was either rice or maize based, but didn't contain gluten, were getting miraculously better. And he wondered whether there was some constituent in wheat that might be causing this. And he did a series of experiments. He went to a local biochemist who was able to measure fat content in stool. And high fat content in stool is a marker of malabsorption, which is what happens in celiac disease. And he found that once these kids were put on a wheat-free diet, that the fat content in the stool went down. When they were put back on it, the fat content went up. The irony is that for all the hundreds of thousands of papers since published on celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, Dicke couldn't get his paper published. He sent it to a journal, a big American journal in pediatrics. They didn't even acknowledge receiving the paper. And he eventually published it as his doctoral thesis, and finally in a Scandinavian journal. But a group from Birmingham got into the Lancet long after he had found the cause. So I've referred to these people in my book as the craggy individualists because they had skin in the game. They kind of worked on their own hunches because they had a feel for what was going on clinically. Now, they weren't always right, but very often they were right. And so I kind of think this guy is a heroic figure because he was the antithesis of everything that's going on now. He was reticent. He didn't push himself. He worked independently. He didn't have a big grant. He didn't have a huge team around him. And there were many other, as I say, craggy individualists who contributed great things during this golden age. So another example is endoscopy, which is now, the kind of core of my speciality, gastroenterology. And the technology behind that was developed by a physicist called Harold Hopkins working at Imperial in the 1950s. And he found a way of transmitting light down through glass fibers. And typically, of course, his finding was not acted upon in Britain. It was the Americans and the Japanese who went off and acted upon it. Another great discovery towards the end of the Golden Age was finding the cause of peptic ulcer. So these two Australians, Marshall and Warren, found that it was due to a bacterium. And the medical establishment at the time couldn't accept this because they had worked along the theory that it was always acid related, that that gastric acid was the cause of ulcers and that you cured ulcers by reducing gastric acid. And they had this kind of cognitive dissonance when these two Australians who weren't part of any massive research group said, no, we found these funny little bugs on the lining of the stomach. What's more, we've found that if you can get rid of them with a course of antibiotics, these duodenal ulcers miraculously heal. So again, they had skin in the game. They had noticed these things where other people had dismissed them as, contamination. They acted upon a hunch. So these are just three random examples of discoveries in my speciality or my discipline during the Golden Age. And then in my lifetime, science became taken over. Well, not science, but academic medicine was taken over by people who no longer worked at the clinical coalface. So there were people who led huge research groups whose sole function was to bring in grant money, supervise PhDs and postdocs, and build these huge sort of empires. During the Golden Age, the leadership in medicine was predominantly within the clinical context. I call these people the clinician aristocrats. They worked in the great teaching hospitals and they viewed their job as leadership and teaching. So I wrote in the book about my experience when I was in the NHS, where I worked for one of the great clinician aristocrats, professor of medicine in England, who was active as a clinician, as a teacher, and as a researcher. And when he retired, I was, his last senior registrar. And when he retired, his post was effectively taken over by a molecular biologist who never saw patients at all, ever. And that was kind of symbolic of that shift in power from the hospitals and the wards and the clinics to the laboratories. The new type of leadership in medicine was all about bringing in grant money, supervising postdocs, doing laboratory-based research. So back to your point, Kieran, they didn't have skin in the game, and they still to this day don't have skin in the game. They are divorced from the realities of clinical medicine. Now, some of them get around this by doing the odd token clinic, and they talk at meetings and so on, or even in the media saying, oh, well, of course, I'm still an active clinician. But the truth is, the vast majority of them no longer are. They don't have the skin in the game.
So just as a follow-on, Seamus, interesting point to note, Seamus, Barry Marshall, the Barry Marshall Library is where I defended my PhD at the University of Western Australia.
Okay.
And where I did my PhD at the University of Western Australia, the building I was in was right next door to the Barry Marshall Library. So when you were saying that in the book, I was like, oh, that's an interesting touch point. So so there's a bit of a crossover there.
That's Perth, I presume.
That's right, yeah. So I've been in Perth, Western Australia for the last 20 years or so.
So
this obviously spoke to me, Seamus, because I'm a scientific consultant. I've never worked full-time in academia. And I've got a mixture of a background between engineering, business, education, and a PhD in science. And so what I do a lot of times, I work with companies, or I work with elite sports athletes, or individuals or teams around this application of the research to common practice, kind of that application of stuff as well to meet a problem. So a couple of things I wanted to ask you about is, do you think we might say today that people are focused on problems, which I don't actually think they are in academia. I think they're focused on producing the papers, like you said, and they're just focused on playing the game. No one's really focused on problem statements or big picture stuff. No one's really kind of tackling those, kind of going, all right, what's the kind of 5 papers I can get out of this one data set? And can I get a PhD out of that and bring a PhD student in to do that? And I get my name as senior author, and I'll use those publications to put on grants and so on. So that's part one, I think, that's happening. The other thing is, you would think over time, you described this golden age from the 30s to the 80s, and you would think, like, kind of using that Pareto chart principle, that 80% of those big changes would have happened. And then to get the last 20% out, that, with technology, with internet, with the way we communicate, it's easier now for academics to be plugged in with clinicians or applied scientists like myself in the field. It's easier for us to cross these boundaries with all this technology. But in actual fact, what I think is actually it's getting worse. I think the divide between, like, the ivory tower, so to speak, and what's at the coalface is so, like, separated. It's unbelievable. So why do you think that it's kind of, and well, one is probably, do you think I'm right in saying that it's getting worse? And two is, if it is getting worse, why do you think it's getting worse when we would have thought it would have been getting better? Or is it getting better? And if so, how?
I think the problem is that biomedical research became an end in itself. They're incentivized to produce. And when you incentivize people to produce, they will produce more and more and more. And if you look at the production of biomedical research papers, it has been rising at an exponential rate during my professional lifetime. But the benefits accruing from that output has not increased at an exponential rate, if at all. So the world of biomedical research is driven by perverse incentives. They are incentivized to produce. They are judged by grant income. They are judged by publication metrics. You're familiar with these things like H-index, citation counts, and so on.
I just checked my ResearchGate score today.
So
it's 31.
You know, I don't think Charles Darwin was very worried about his H-index, and many Nobel laureates have come out and said, you know, I wouldn't thrive if I was starting out in today's research environment. And there is a recognition, even within biomedicine, that something has gone drastically wrong, because there is a widespread acceptance that there is this replication crisis. And by that, I mean that the overwhelming majority of biomedical research findings are never repeated or replicated to see if the original finding holds up and is correct. And I wrote in the book about, you know, a symposium that was held in London now nearly over 6 years ago. And they had all the great players in the biomedical research establishment were in there, you know, the Medical Research Council, the Wellcome Trust, and so on. And, you know, there's a consensus that this is a huge problem. But there is a lack of will within medicine, or within biomedical research, should I say, to change this, because it benefits the people at the very top of this pyramid. So when I say pyramid, it is a sort of a pyramid scheme. It's almost a Ponzi scheme, in fact.
I use the same term,
I think there's a good argument that biomedical research is a Ponzi scheme. So at the very top, you have a few elite leaders of large research groups. And they appear on telly wearing white coats and carrying pipettes. They never go near a laboratory because they have armies of postdocs and PhD students doing all of this work for them. And the overwhelming majority of these PhDs and postdocs will never get promotion to a permanent sort of post as researchers. So there's a huge attrition rate. So they're used as sort of laboratory fodder to do all of this. And because there is such intense competition in this world, these more junior researchers then are incredibly incentivized to publish and keep publishing stuff, regardless of its relevance, its importance, or its rigor. So they're incentivized constantly to cut corners, to ask questions that are of no relevance, to produce and to keep producing. And as you know, you quoted there, Kieran, there was a guy called John Platt who said as far back as the 60s, we talk about, each little study being a brick in the wall of science. Well, they're not. Most of these bricks end up being thrown and discarded in the yard. So the culture, the working culture of science is not a healthy one. And as I say, there is a broad acceptance within biomedical science that something has gone drastically wrong. But as I say, there is not the impetus or the will to do something about it. And I think COVID probably has only made it worse, not better.
Just on that topic, before I hand it back to Kieran, Seamus, I work as an adjunct at 2 universities, and I work with a number of PhD students and do my own couple of research projects as well. And at a meeting a few months ago, somebody said, look, if you just put the word COVID anywhere in it, it'll get published like that. I was like, what? Yeah. or if you can get into the title, even better, because they'll turn around the review process like less than 2 weeks as opposed to like 6 months. But if you can get it into the title, better. And if not, get it into the discussion like as a limitation or a potential confounder, or get into the discussion how it changed the data and blah, blah, blah. Because there's this kind of bias now of publishing COVID papers, because of course everybody's clicking on these and they're great news cycles as well. And I think, you obviously spoke about the start of the journals, back around 1951 with the guy who was from the News of the World, which is another great rabbit hole to go down another day. But you kind of see then that could be used and start clicking out these news stories as well to get the clickbait. And then that drives a whole different game, a whole game over here when there's a game played here in academia. It's just fascinating to see how these things interlink and how people are very clever at kind of like playing the game very quickly. It reminds me of the TV show by HBO called The Wire. One of the drug dealers said, it's all in the game. He says, you chase us, you catch us, we come out the next day. It's just a game gets played every which way. So I think it's fascinating how this happens.
There's been a huge migration into COVID research during the last 2 years. Particularly what's worrying is people who have no background in virology or the epidemiology of infectious diseases have migrated into COVID for the reasons that you've mentioned. There's a great phrase actually to describe this it's called epistemic trespassing. And there's been a great deal of epistemic trespassing going on over the past 2 years. And actually, COVID has only worsened this overproduction of medical research, because you now have these platforms where people can publish their stuff without going through peer review or going into journals or whatever. So the COVIDization of research has only worsened this, what I call the medical misinformation mess over the last 2 years. You mentioned, you did mention, but you alluded to Robert Maxwell, and it's interesting that Robert Maxwell, who owned the Daily Mirror, actually, it was the Daily Mirror, not the News of the World.
Oh, was it? Sorry.
Yeah, but he made his first fortune in medical publishing, and it's interesting that his daughter is now very much in the news at the moment, Ghislaine. But
his daughter,
his daughter, yes,
yeah. She was going out with Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah,
no way, what a connection.
Yeah. So Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, made his first million from medical journals. So in the years after the Second World War, he very astutely spotted that there would be a huge market for medical journals. And he figured out that he called this a perpetual money-making machine, because the people who gave the content, the researchers, handed over this content to the journal for free. The people who reviewed the content, the peer reviewers, did it for free. And they were, again, the very same people then who bought the content at the other end. And he thought, he called this a triple pay system, and he knew that it was an absolute winner. And what he did was he persuaded academics in all sorts of fields. It wasn't just biomedicine, but it was physics and engineering and so on, and to launch new journals. And he would place them as the editors of these new journals. He knew that every library in the developed world would buy any new journal that came out. So he set Pergamum Press, which he established in the late 40s, early 50s. He eventually sold on for many millions. So the foundation of his empire was publishing medical journals. So if you want to look back as to if you want to trace back the overproduction of medical research, one of the key players was Robert Maxwell. Now, he died in very mysterious circumstances 30 years ago, fell off his yacht. Did he fall? Was he pushed? Did he jump? And this was after he had been found to have drained the pension fund of the Daily Mirror. So it all goes back, if you trace it all, a lot of this goes back to Robert Maxwell, one of the great corporate crooks.
Yeah, 1991, Kieran. He fell off. I think I was about 13 or 14 when it happened. I remember being in the papers. There's a picture of him on his boat with his belly hanging out, and it was like he's gone, type of thing. Yeah. So yeah, and now his daughter's going to jail as well for her collaboration with Epstein. So yeah.
on the kind of direction that was taken, like you mentioned, let's say with research, and this is something that you alluded to in the book as well. But there's that kind of phrase, when there's this focus in the research on, and in medicine in general, but the research world epitomizes it on things that can be measured, like these H indexes, etc., and publication counts, etc. There's that kind of phrase. What way is it worded? Is that it's something like not everything that can be measured is important, and not everything that is important can be measured.
Correct.
But there's a hyper focus in this kind of modern era of this focus on what is quantitative, as opposed to a recognition that the qualitative even exists. It's like that. It's gone that excessive.
Yeah. This obsession with metrics has sometimes been called the McNamara fallacy. And this is named after Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, as they pronounced it, during the Vietnam conflict. Not for all of the Vietnam conflict, but for much of it. He was appointed Secretary of Defense by JFK, and continued under Johnson, and was eventually ousted by Johnson. But during the sort of the worst period of the Vietnam conflict, he essentially was in charge of running the war. And McNamara, who was a very clever man, had a background in industry. He was president of the Ford Corporation when he was headhunted by the White House to come in to be Secretary of Defense. And he applied the same sort of numerical, quantitative, metrical methods to the running of the war as he had applied to the running of the Ford Corporation. He saw them as essentially the same things. And he became obsessed with particularly enemy body counts. And he had formed the idea that if they reached particular targets in terms of enemy dead, that they would eventually be victorious. And what he didn't reckon with was that the conflict was far more complicated than simple, counting bodies. And anyway, the body counts were wildly inaccurate. It distracted McNamara and the Americans from taking a more qualitative global view as to what the hell was going on. And many years later, McNamara was the subject of a fabulous documentary called The Fog of War, where in his old age, he was interviewed. This documentary is about 20 years old, and he admitted that he had completely got it wrong, that he had failed to understand what was going on in Vietnam. He had failed to study the qualitative things, the non-metrical things. He had failed to study the history, the culture of this country. He thought that it was a simple war of communism versus capitalism, whereas in fact, he realized decades later that he had walked into a civil war and didn't understand that and became obsessed with these metrics. Now, the McNamara fallacy, the term was coined in the early 70s by a chap called Yankelovich. And it has become linked with McNamara ever since. But McNamara, I think, was man enough and big enough and broad enough in later years to go back and look at his mistakes and see where he had gone wrong. So Yankelovich said the first step is to measure whatever can be measured. That's okay as far as it goes. The second step is to regard what can't be easily measured and give it an arbitrary value. This is artificial and misleading. The third step is to presume that what can't be measured isn't important. This is blindness. And the fourth step is to say that what can't be easily measured doesn't exist. This is suicide. So I wrote about the McNamara fallacy in medicine, and it's all over medicine. Trolley counts, waiting times. It led to the target culture that ruined the National Health Service in the last 2 decades and led indirectly to the Stafford scandal. I was fascinated to see an interview with Jeremy Hunt, who was the most reviled and hated health secretary in the history of the National Health Service. He was in the job for a long time, and from the economic crash to about 2017. And he was asked in an interview recently by Matthew Syed if he would change one thing over his tenure, or if he could change one thing now in the NHS, what would that be? And he said, I would not have concentrated on targets. And when someone like that admits that, it's almost like McNamara admitting, 30 years after, his involvement in Vietnam, 35 years actually, I got it wrong. And that was interesting. And I think it's interesting when major public figures like that do come out and say, yes, I got that wrong. And these are the reasons why I got it wrong. And the target culture in the British National Health Service led to all sorts of perverse incentives. It incentivized in all sorts of terrible behavior on the part of mainly managers, but also doctors as well. And when you have someone like Jeremy Hunt coming out saying that was a really bad idea, I think that's interesting. And I'm surprised that more people didn't latch on to that.
An interesting crossover there, Seamus, is it's a book I'm reading at the moment called, which I told Karen about, only came out a few months ago here in Australia, called Mortals: How the Fear of Death Shaped Human Society, by Rachel Menzies and Ross Menzies. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It came out in September. But in their opening chapter of that book, they talk about this constant obsession with metrics in human society. And it's nearly like, the way they alluded to, it's nearly like a way of staving off the fear of death in the future. It's like, people think about death and it happens in another country, it happens to somebody else, it doesn't happen to me. And this constant like obsession with metrics. And even from, and I've been guilty of this before with lots of long distance running I used to do, but they're saying things like, you do an Ironman, but then it's like, do 2 Ironmans back to back, swim the English Channel, or who can do a butterfly, who can do a backstroke. So people are constantly like trying to just build upon stuff and have records and exceed metrics. And it's in all business now as well. You see it in business from top down management. It's right down. It's this kind of the stratified theory of management, the integration of KPIs right down to the guy that has a broom sweeping a floor. He's got metrics to hit every day, every week. Everything has to be measured. And it's like we don't take into account the person's feelings, where they are in their life, what they want to do, what their goals are. It's just like we're looking at everybody like lines of data. And I know it sounds a bit stupid, but it's nearly like it's becoming a matrix where everything is just numbers everywhere. And we're obsessed with numbers and not about, how people feel, how people are, or the quality, which is really concerning.
Yeah, this obsession with metrics is not just, medicine and healthcare, it's
everywhere
throughout society. So it's education, it's policing, it's business. So it's all over. But getting back to something you said earlier about the our collective fear of death, this is very much in my mind right now, because as I think I mentioned earlier, the report of the Lancet Commission that I've been working on over the last 4 years with, a group of 25 roughly people from all over the world and from all sorts of disciplines, that's coming out in the end of January, published by the Lancet. And much of human behavior, many would argue, including that book that you mentioned, is driven by this fear of death, particularly in high income societies. And I guess the message of the commission that I've been working on is that we have to rebalance our relationship with death. We've come to view it as, as something that must be prevented at all costs, that death is an unalloyed evil, whereas we would argue in our commission that it has value. To quote somebody else, if death did not exist, every birth would be a tragedy, and death allows for for us as a species to sustain ourselves, and we seem to have forgotten that. And I think there is a connection with this fear of death and the pandemic. I think they're all connected with they ultimately are down to our disconnection from nature. We have forgotten that we are part of nature. We have assumed now for a long time that we are the masters of nature and not part of it. And I think that the climate emergency, the pandemic, and our fear of death and disconnection with it are all down to that single thing. And they are all connected, these three things. And healthcare, my particular neck of the woods, has had a very unhealthy relationship with death and dying. And I guess that's how I first came to, that was my first book, was writing about that unhealthy relationship that medicine and healthcare has with death and dying. And while we have this disconnection and unhealthy relationship with death and dying, both in medicine, but in high-income societies generally, we have this paradox that in low-income countries, people are dying very often without access to even the basics like morphine, let alone formal palliative care. So while we in the West, in the high-income West, or global North, as they say, spend vast sums on, let's say, cancer treatments, which have tiny marginal attritional benefits, people are dying in low-income countries of preventable diseases, and they're dying without access to even the basics, as I say, morphine in particular. There is a huge problem with global access to morphine. While we in the North are in the high-income countries, then, particularly in North America, there are swathes of people dying because of over-access to opiates. So we have this kind of global paradox going on. So I think I'm very excited about this report coming out. I think it's got a very relevant, timely message because it links, I think, our fear of death, it links the climate emergency, and it links the pandemic. And I think they're all stemming from the same thing. So I'm very excited about this report. And I hope it's going to be an ongoing piece of work, that it won't just end with the publication of this report, that it might, and I'm being very optimistic here, but that it might lead to a recalibration, at least within healthcare and medicine, a rethinking of our relationship with death. And we've argued that in developed societies that death is now an institutionalized, medicalized phenomenon. But death, but we in medicine, we in healthcare, hospitals, institutions can't provide the context, the support that families and communities used to provide. So in a way, our theme is going right back to people like Ivan Illich in the 1970s, who argued that medicine and healthcare was institutionalizing death, which is a part of human life and a part of what we are, and is there to be valued, not fought against to the bitter end. So I've worked, as I say, with a bunch of people from all over the world who are not just from healthcare. They come from religious life, from philosophy, from sociology, from philosophy, from the arts. That's been a marvelous experience for me, because I think in medicine and healthcare, you get very blinkered. Your vision is very tunneled. You only think of things in relationship to your experience and to your particular community. And to have that, first of all, global sort of view, but also that kind of multidisciplinary perspective was fantastic. And we thought initially that when the pandemic arrived, that it would somehow make our work less relevant. And then we realized, no, this is all actually, the whole thing is linked together and made it more relevant than ever. So I'm really excited about this report coming out in the next few weeks.
Can I just jump in there quickly? Because you're preaching to the choir with this stuff on death. Like we've interviewed here people from, for example, the second or third episode or both were with people from the Ernest Becker Institute, Ernest Becker of the Denial of Death. And so it's something that we're definitely both going to want to explore. But before we move on to that, I think there's something that you touched on there that I think is a really, really, really powerful point that you brought up in the book. And it's also reflected in the pandemic, where to a large extent, a lot of the measures that were taken in the pandemic seemed to be most beneficial to those who were already at least risk from the virus, like the laptop class, as it's been referred to as, whereas a lot of vulnerable people were continued to be exposed, and those of lower socioeconomic status were sent out as essential workers, regardless of comorbidity status, etc. And there was this really perverse approach and I think it was also reflected in things like hunger and malnutrition issues and all sorts of issues that took place all over the world, especially in developing countries, where the people that were most dramatically impacted were those who were already the most vulnerable. And you at one point in the book wrote about Julian Tudor Hart and his inverse care law, which I think is something that you towards the end of the book kind of allude to, but would you mind elaborating upon the inverse care law? Because I think it's such a powerful thing when you mention morphine there in the developing world and millions of people dying in totally avoidable pain and suffering if there was just a little bit of money put toward being able to provide painkillers that we know already work really well, versus the amount of the almost unquantifiable billions that are put into research that have marginal benefits around prolonging death or postponing death for a month or two or whatever at the cost of billions and billions of research, because that's where the money is to be made. So would you mind talking to that a bit?
Yeah, Julian Tudor Hart was a GP and who was a socialist. And he coined this phrase, the inverse care law, which means that the quantity of medical care is inversely related to the need of that population for care. So the rich get a lot of medical care, and the poor, who need more medical care globally get the least. So healthcare accounts for only about 10 to 20% of variations in your health. Your health is far more influenced by your education and your income. So the pandemic has worsened global inequality. And as you rightly point out, the pandemic has disproportionately affected poorer populations, poorer countries, marginalized populations. In Britain, as we know, it's poorer communities, particular ethnic groups have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And I mentioned, and you've mentioned, the problem of global access to opiates at the end of life. It's been estimated that the cost of fixing this is $150 million. To put this into context and perspective, that's the annual budget of a mid-sized American hospital, right? Mm. To fix a major global problem, that's what it would actually cost. We've seen already that countries in sub-Saharan Africa many of them have a tiny percentage of their population are now vaccinated, yet Israel is now on to a fourth vaccine. So the pandemic has only worsened the inequalities that existed before it arrived. And by the way, it's given a huge boost to the pharmaceutical industry. And people within pharma are now saying this has been the best thing that has happened to our reputation in decades. So Pfizer, for example, came, I think, second to bottom in some poll pre-pandemic of reputation, of corporate reputation. They came right at the bottom. And for them, this pandemic has been an outstanding success.
36 billion so far, I think they reckon, for the last 12 months.
So, but not only the money, their reputation has received a huge boost. So all of the things, this book that, Can Medicine Be Cured, came out early in 19, a year before the pandemic, and everything I wrote about has only been exacerbated during the pandemic. It was interesting, actually, that in the final chapter, I did write about the possibility of a pandemic. Now, I don't claim any special gifts of seeing into the future or clairvoyance on this, because many people had predicted a pandemic. What I didn't foresee, however, was that it would strengthen the position of pharma, the medical industrial complex, the biomedical research industry, that it would exacerbate existing inequalities both within countries and globally. And I didn't really foresee that, but it has, undoubtedly.
There's actually a quote that you had towards the end of the book that I use. I published an essay recently about some kind of key areas around the pandemic, because I finish on, actually I had actually written this essay and published it before I finished the last chapter and a half or 2 chapters of this book, because I was reading something else and finished something else and writing this essay. And I ended up finishing along similar lines around what we might be doing instead. And I touched on I went to a kind of a lit review on some of the critiques, or some key papers and critiques on some of the lockdown policies, etc., and the disproportionate socioeconomic impact that it had, and health impact on those already most disproportionately affected, or those already most vulnerable. And I ended up finishing on a kind of a focus on things like other existential risks, genuine risks that we're putting such a disproportionate amount of time and energy now into one area, and we're potentially not going to get the disaster we expect. We're going to these other areas that we should be preparing for, that we could potentially be putting effort on. And one of the things I mentioned, I took one quote here from the end of the book that I think summarizes some really key points. And basically, just like you said, pointed out that this book was published in 2019, your book, and that these trends that you mentioned in this one half a paragraph here were basically accelerated and amplified and deepened by the pandemic. So I'll read the paragraph. I think it summarized what you said there. So you said, the current priorities of medicine, with the cathedral-like teaching hospitals and biomedical research at the top, and community and hospice care at the bottom, will have to be turned upside down. I am not optimistic that this will happen. Strong societal forces will almost certainly ensure that the current consensus prevails. These forces include the commodification of all human life, the overweening power of giant international corporations, the decline of both politics and the professions, the sclerosis of compliance and regulation, the fetishization of safety, the narcissism of the internet and social media, but above all, the spiritual dwarfism of our age, which would reduce us to digitized machines in need of constant surveillance and maintenance. So when I got to that paragraph and saw that this pandemic basically took those trends and gave them steroids and and let them off, it was an unbelievably prescient paragraph. So would you, is there any thoughts on that?
I think we should call Seamus the Oracle.
No, in fact, I kind of slightly got it wrong in that I thought if there was a pandemic with a virus with a much higher mortality than COVID, that it might change things. So I was thinking along the lines of, I took a scenario where if you had a virus with a 30% mortality,
smallpox,
correct, that might have been the bomb that would have changed things. But instead, what we got was something slightly different with a relatively low mortality, but which was a pandemic. And I did not foresee that it, as you say, Kieran, it gave steroids to all of the things that were there before it.
It was kind of a minimally viable emergency. It was this awful sweet spot where it was bad enough to be a legitimate emergency, but it wasn't bad enough to kind of function as an Independence Day scenario where the aliens have showed up and we now need to realize we're all team people and we're all in the same boat.
Correct.
It was like a sweet spot where it wasn't bad enough. Whereas the first few weeks, it was really interesting. The first few weeks where it started hitting Europe, there was a sense of before political lines were drawn between certain strategies, or before there was a politicization of certain things. There was a kind of no one knew where the lines were, and the death rates from Italy were like 7%, and there was who knows what the hell was going on in China because of the Communist Party suppressing media, etc. So we didn't know what was going on, all the uncertainties, and no one knew where the political lines were between certain strategies or approaches. And then there was a real felt sense of, oh shit, there's something big happening. We're all in this together kind of a mentality. But then once the dust started settling, it became a kind of a minimal viable emergency that was bad enough to scare us and to elicit fear and anger. But then there was also wasn't bad enough to get us to all kind of unite under the one umbrella of let's genuinely stay together and realize we're all on the same pale blue dot, to use Carl Sagan's kind of line.
Yeah, that's very true. And the historian Yuval Noah Harari wrote a very good piece last year for The Guardian, the year before last now. And he pointed out the exact same thing, that when the pandemic first arrived, there was this feeling of helplessness. And there was this, I think, heart-searching. This has happened because we've messed around with nature. And we are reaping this bitter harvest now. But then that narrative and that feeling dissipated very quickly to the new narrative, which is science has saved us and now we can all get back to business as usual. And it's thanks to science that we're going to get back to business as usual. So that initial kind of philosophical gazing into our souls and into our hearts dissipated very quickly. As I have said, I think that the pandemic has only strengthened the position of the biomedical research industry, the big pharma, and so on, and so on, and so on. But we did have a brief period, and a very interesting period, of philosophical introspection when it started. But as you say, Kieran, it was bad, but not quite bad enough for us to change.
An interesting point you made in the chapter, the mirage of progress, I think is directly applicable to the way things are. So initially, when it looked like that the most probable situation, before any of this evidence started piling up around I've been quite convinced by all the arguments and essays and everything I've read about the lab leak hypothesis as the most probable cause from around the Wuhan Institute of Virology, etc. They're quite, if it's not the case, then it's one of the most interesting coincidence to ever happen in human history. If it not, it seemed fascinating. So if that turns out to be the case, and then you look at the history behind or the potential links to, for example, the stuff that we've been talking about around big data, this idea of doing research for sometimes its own sake, this idea of potentially doing research that might even be harmful. And then we look at, while science to a large extent, obviously, like this mRNA technology is unbelievable science that could have really powerful impacts potentially for all sorts of other treatments, and it could spark a whole new area of biotech, etc. But at the same time, there's a double-edged sword to science, which may very well have been that some of the research that the pandemic may very well have escaped on some, or the virus may very well have escaped in someone's shoe in Wuhan, just from a poorly run lab and that was already had been warned about a couple of years before, etc. And you had the brilliant few lines here at the beginning of the mirage of progress, where you said, the benefits of science seem so self-evident that only a fool or a madman would question it, or the idea of progress. But science, which gave us all of these unalloyed benefits, also gave us nuclear bombs and napalm. It is entirely possible that technology may render the world uninhabitable for humans. Then progress will end. And that fascinating scenario where if there's the potential, so while you mentioned there the potential, and referencing Harari, that there was a soul searching at the start around when there was the likelihood that this, or the most probable likelihood that was being discussed was that this was from the wet market, interference with nature and encroachment upon wild places and interaction with animals that we maybe shouldn't be interacting with on a regular basis. And then, but now, let's say that that's lower probability than the Wuhan Institute of Virology argument. That's also a really powerful drive towards soul searching in terms of, okay, look, we have, to use a phrase that I've gotten from a lad, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and he's similar to Toby Ord, is that we have now the power of gods, but we don't have the associated love and wisdom of gods. So we have this capacity to unleash components of nature and to harness the power of nature to such enormous degree that we have these capacities to build nuclear bombs, like you mentioned, or other weapons, or to be able to build horrendous viruses and summon demons from nature that nature herself might never have come up with. An example being the H5N1 strain that was modified in 2011 by those two labs to be transmissible between mammals, but has a 60% mortality rate. That was one of the reasons that the American government shut down or put a moratorium on funding gain of function research. That in terms of, as a wake-up call to this capacity, or this capacity that we have to manipulate components of nature, but realistically, what are we actually trying to do? What's the point of our research? What's the benefit? What are we actually trying to do with this power? And that could be a potential driver of more soul searching, hopefully. Or am I being too naive here?
No, not at all. I mean, I think one of the questions that this Lancet Commission group are posing to biomedical research is, well, why are we trying to extend human life through biomedical research when human life is already becoming almost unsustainable? Why are we trying to extend average life expectancy into, 100 or 120 or beyond, when we have this climate crisis at our door? We have overpopulation. Why are we trying to do this? And I'm asking the question. There's been this assumption within biomedicine that, it's a good thing. Who would question it? I mean, why would you question it? It's interesting that my friend Richard Smith, who's a former editor of the British Medical Journal and is the chairman of this Lancet Commission, he once asked a group of sort of leaders of biomedicine, what is your aim? Are you hoping to cure all disease? And they had to sort of say, yeah, we are. And then he said, okay, so what are we going to die of then? And they didn't have an answer. And we haven't had a discussion as a society on, well, do we want significant extension to our longevity? Would it be a good thing? We've always assumed, yeah, of course it'd be a good thing. But we haven't actually sat down and talked amongst ourselves and said, well, what are the downsides? What are the costs? And do we really want to extend human lifespan in a world that is already overpopulated, in a world that is already phobic about death, in a world where people in poor countries are dying young of entirely preventable and treatable diseases and not getting access to morphine when they die? Do we want to extend? Why should people in rich countries live to be 150? And a lot of this, as you know, is being driven by, Silicon Valley. What's the one thing that you can't buy if you're Jeff Bezos at the moment? You can't buy immortality. And there's a fascinating story going on, and Mark O'Connell has written about this, about transhumanism.
Apocalypse Never or something is Apocalypse. Notes from the Apocalypse.
To be a machine is the book. Yeah. And so, there is this huge drive from Silicon Valley. This is their next frontier, is life extension and even immortality. And this seems to me to be about the worst answer to our current existential crisis. This is only adding to this phobia and fear of death. And I would argue, and my sort of co-commissioners in the Lancet report would argue, that we need to embrace death. We need to see it as having value. We need to see it as part of life. We need to see it as a renewal. We don't need to be plowing billions into life extension biogerontology when there's so much inequality, and when we have these existential threats already in the form of the climate crisis and possible more pandemics. So the rich are still driving a very different narrative to the rest of us. And I think the next decade is going to be incredibly interesting. I don't know what's going to happen. I hope I'm around to see it.
I think this is interesting, Seamus, because it's nearly what you're saying there is like a blueprint of what we spoke about before, about this drive for numbers. And again, with H indexes and, research gate scores and publications, It's the same about life as well. Just like, oh, I'm going to live like nearly forever. And I've dubbed this myself personally, talking to people over the last year or two, the immortality complex. Like people think that they're immortal, that they're going to live forever. And what's interesting, as I find, is that, I said at the start of the podcast, me and Kieran are kind of like, we want to get the juice out of the bone in life, and we want to have a good quality of life. We do martial arts, we have these conversations, we study, we're physical, we're trying to hit all these different domains to be multidisciplinary, well-rounded humans and enjoy lots of different things. But what I find interesting is that people are not even talking about quality of life. Like, I've had morbidly obese people lecture me on, science and medicine with no qualifications, because they've Googled stuff or they've read op-ed pieces or whatever it might be. But they're the ones in there are terrified of dying. And I just think it's absolutely bananas in today's day and age that no one's focused on quality. It's all this prolonged hide away in your house, be on the internet, don't go out in the sun, like lower levels of vitamin D because you might get too burnt. Don't go outside because you might get too cold. Don't walk too far, don't run too far. We're getting sicker, we're getting fatter. We've got all these wearable technologies in the sleep world where I work in, but people are sleeping less. It's like the weighing scales that didn't, cure the obesity epidemic as well. See, all these things happen. And I'm just looking at it all kind of passing by, and I'm only 43 and I'm kind of going, my God, what is happening? And now I'm hearing people like David Sinclair and these people like academics in the US talking about this extension of life. I'm like, can't we focus on quality, and can't we focus on current problems like you're talking about, people dying in Africa with malaria? Like, I've worked in Africa on projects, and you see kids running out onto the side of the road begging for water as we drove by in four-wheel drives. You're giving kids crates of water. But meanwhile, then at home, people are absolutely going batshit crazy about the internet dropping out, and you got kids on the side of the road begging for bottles of water. The disparity is mental, and people's drive in Western culture is absolutely just so disconnected from the planet and the rest of people. To me, it's just mind-boggling. I could go on for hours with examples like this.
Yes, and I think getting back to medicine, where I started, I argued in the book that it is ruled by what I call a feeble philosophy that sees man as a machine, concerned only with material comfort and survival into extreme old age. And there was a great French microbiologist and philosopher called René Dubos. And he wrote that that's okay, that might be applied, that philosophy, to ants and cows, but not to humans, that we are meant to struggle to embrace danger, that we value things beyond comfort and longevity. And so I have tried to inject a bit of, I suppose, philosophy and thinking, and I hope humanity, back into the world where I worked for so long, which I felt was lacking, that we weren't asking these bigger questions of what we were about and why we were doing it and what we were there for. And ultimately, I finished the book with this guy, Major Greenwood. Major was not his military title. That was actually his first name. He was a famous statistician. And he was asked what was medicine for? What was it there for? And he didn't answer it, it's there to cure disease and to prolong life and all that kind of stuff. He said it's there to relieve suffering, which I thought was really interesting, coming from one of the great sort of figures from the golden age. It's there to relieve suffering. And we kind of forgot that, I think, in medicine, that was our core function. That's what we're there for. I mean, great if we can cure, but ultimately that's actually what we're there is to relieve suffering. We're not there to extend life to 150 years. We're there to relieve suffering. And I've long thought that, and more recently argued, that maybe we should spend less on medicine. Maybe it should pull back into this core function of relieving suffering, because increasingly the world is dominated by healthcare. It's 1/5 of the US economy. and growing all the time, with, marginal benefits and many downsides. And maybe medicine should pull back from its cultural hegemony into a core function of relieving suffering. And I worried that I was a sort of sole voice within medicine, but I don't think so. Many people from within healthcare have spoken to me about these ideas, and I think there's a groundswell of support for it. I think I merely articulated the concerns that a lot of people within healthcare, the people with skin in the game, getting back to your phrase again, Kieran, have. And yet it's the people who don't have skin in the game who are leading the entire enterprise at the moment. And unfortunately, the pandemic has only made that worse. I wish I could be more optimistic.
I actually that might be a great way to end, unless you have any final comments or questions for Seamus, Kieran.
I know we've gone a few minutes past the hard cutoff, but there was one point that myself and Ian had we've talked about a related area so many times offline and on podcasts, and it's the destructive influence and corrupting influence that postmodern philosophies have had that have gone into fields that they have no business in. Like that, we see it. I see it in even in there was an unbelievably powerful letter published earlier in 2021 and maybe June by a professor of physical chemistry from University of either Southern California or University of Santa Barbara, but this Professor Anna Krylov, who had grown up in the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah.
And it's called The Perils of Politicizing Science. And it was this open letter basically pointing out how the infiltration of some of this postmodern critical theory, kind of what she'd maybe described as kind of like neo-Marxist, identity-focused, is even infiltrating STEM and chemistry and in causing the renaming of things, diversity hires where people are being hired not because of competence, but because of certain identity characteristics to tick boxes for administrative HR departments. And when you touched on that in medicine, it was a totally unexpected thing for me to come across in the book, but then it made so much sense because I'd come across even earlier, or even yesterday, I just came across this new thing in related to COVID in New York, where they brought in a couple of weeks ago, race-based policies in New York for the application of and not antivirals, but in hospital inpatient treatments, where they're going to stratify treatments based on race, because they're using race as, let's say, a proxy for past systemic oppression. Rather than focus on comorbidities and treating the individual, they're going to actually just genuinely influence a racist policy that's racist against the oppressor class in New York hospitals, which is just like this. It's like we're going back to the 1960s in reverse. It's just this bizarre infiltration of what you've called narrative medicine. So I know we've gone a bit over, but would you have any thoughts on that? Because it's something that I meant to get to, but we ended up going down some fascinating rabbit holes, and it's something that concerns me deeply across the board. And so,
I wrote a paper. I had done a lot of the work already before I wrote this book. And one of the essays that I had written some years ago was called Against Narrative Medicine, which I published in an American journal. And narrative medicine is this movement which began in the US in the 90s, I guess, which was kind of part of the whole postmodernist sort of enterprise. And there is a new discipline which you may or may not have heard of called medical humanities. And the sort of stated function of this discipline is that it might bring a more humanistic approach to medical practice. And unfortunately, the medical humanities have been infiltrated and essentially kind of dominated by two things: narrative medicine and postmodernism. So the academics who are involved with medical humanities tend not to be people like me with skin in the game. They tend to be people coming from a critical theory, post-structuralist, postmodernist academic background, who have a very clear political agenda. And I have argued instead for a different type of medical humanities, a medical humanities that addresses all of these big questions that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half: the pandemic, the climate crisis, longevity, death, the big questions. This is what I think medical humanities should be tackling. But instead, it's gone down this rabbit hole, this academic postmodernist rabbit hole. It's very much on my mind at the moment because I'm working on my fourth book, which is essentially about the history of psychoanalysis and Freudianism. And I'm trying to figure out how this mode of thinking achieved such cultural dominance in the early part of the 20th century. Now, within medicine, Freudianism has lost all sort of credibility because it doesn't work. Okay, that's the big problem with it. It lacks any evidential sort of basis, but it retains huge influence and standing in the academic humanities. That's where it lives. So all the contemporary Freudians are essentially postmodernist humanities academics. So it still lives on in there. So now, having said all of that, I have cause to be very grateful to a department of medical humanities, the Centre for the Humanities and Health in King's College London, which is actually part of the department. They're within a sort of English literature department, and but they are very open, and I think they wanted someone like me coming from a clinical background to come in and have this dialogue about all of these things that we've been talking to, and they don't want to disappear down this, this rabbit hole. And so I'm actively engaging with people from that kind of background at the moment. As I say, because of COVID, I haven't had the chance to visit. My title is visiting professor, and unfortunately, I've done no visiting, which is a great shame. But I'm hoping that once restrictions are lifted, that I can get involved with that again. But getting back to your original point, Kieran, yes, this has become a major battleground in universities, and I think it's a great shame because we're losing sight of these big questions that we've talked about for the last hour and a half, these big existential questions that are facing us as a species. I don't care about the academic questions. I care about the existential questions. Mm-hmm. And I think postmodernism has distracted us from these existential, important questions. And it's a great shame. It is a great shame.
And not only function as a distraction, but also functioned as a source of division and reciprocal radicalization, and it's provided ammunition for people who want reasons or look for reasons on, let's say, the other side of the political spectrum to criticize academia, to criticize science, that any excuse. And then when we see crazy policies being influenced or introduced based on these pseudo-academic disciplines that are making these vast claims, it provides not only a source of division and a source of conflict, but also ammunition for critics that are looking for reasons to criticize medicine, criticize science, criticize academia at large. It's just like an industrial solvent that's so harmful. But it's basically, it's coming across as it's a totalitarian ideology in the guise of compassion. It's masking itself behind words like justice, equality, diversity, inclusion, etc. But it's actually a source of conflict rather than something that's a unifying force.
Yes, and I think there is a deep anti-scientism at the heart of postmodernism. And it was interesting that, when I published this book, I got contacted by people who had assumed that because I was critiquing the medical industrial complex, that, I was somehow anti-science. And I had to say to them, sorry, actually, no, you've got this completely wrong. I couldn't be more pro-science.
Yeah.
What I'm against is the abuse and misuse of it.
Yeah.
I believe completely in empiricism. I'm a Humean skeptic. I believe in the scientific method. I was writing about how it has been hijacked and abused. But the last thing I am is anti-science and postmodernist.
It's because you're pro-science, you're critical of those things, not because because you understand science, what science actually is, not what quote unquote the science as in this industry is, or the science as in just papers, body of knowledge.
Yeah, I'm writing from within the medical industrial complex, and that's why I understand it, and I can critique it. Because I know what's going on. I spent long enough, and I in research, I've published a lot of papers. I know how this works, and I've been guilty of some of the things that I have critiqued. I've been guilty of, publishing stuff that I knew was just being done to further a career. So I know about these things. But as I say, because I critiqued it, some of these people thought, oh, he must be in our camp. And nothing could be further from the truth. And so I'm hoping that I've got enough left in me that I want to go into the medical humanities. And I wanted to become an engine to discuss these big questions. I don't want it to get lost in, this kind of virtual signaling of narrative medicine and these distracting and divisive social justice debates. I want it to embrace these big questions that I've so enjoyed talking to you both about over the last hour and a half, nearly 2 hours now.
In a parallel universe, Seamus, we were sitting in 3 big armchairs in front of the fire with copious pots of tea and Kimberly Mikado biscuits that I miss, and we'd be talking about this for 12 hours straight or more into the hours of the morning. But unfortunately, the pandemic keeps us apart. Lifestyles keeps us apart. But this is a conversation I would love to have in person and to drag you away for 12 to 24 hours and say, because I think the 3 of us could sit here and talk about a multitude of things for hours and hours and hours. Such a nourishing conversation. And I want to really thank you, Seamus, for your time today. It's been absolutely brilliant. My only regret is that we have to hang up this phone and not talk for another 6 hours. But we will put the links of your book into the show notes for the podcast and on YouTube as well. But if anybody wants to get in contact with you, Seamus, are you on any social media? Do you have any websites? Do you have anything where people can go on and find out more about you?
Yeah, I don't do social media.
Like Kieran.
I have a website, and so just put in Google Seamus O'Mahony home, and you'll find my website. I don't do social media. That discussion could be another 2-hour podcast, but I don't do social media. No, but I do have a website with all sorts of links to my stuff and a link to an email contact and so on. So yeah, So I am accessible. Yeah.
Excellent.
So thank you both very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Seamus. Really enjoyed it. And hopefully someday when I'm back in Ireland and I'm down the way of Cork, I'll give you a call, and hopefully we can have that cup of tea or go for a walk and talk more. It'd be great to meet in person and shake your hands.
That'd be great. Okay. All right. Thanks,
awesome.
Ian.
Thanks, Seamus.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.